Good morning. I'm John Watkins. I'm Head of Gardens and Landscape for the English Heritage Trust. We look after over 400 properties all over England, from great stately homes, the home of Queen Victoria shown here at Osborne, to Stonehenge, to Hadrian's Wall. And great landscapes we have, but also some amazing gardens. The role of English heritage is telling England's story through its properties. And the job of me and my team is to tell England's garden story. And amongst our properties, we cover garden development from Kenilworth Castle, which was built for Elizabeth I in 1575, right up to contemporary gardens that we created ourselves in the early part of this century. And so our main focus is to be able to present these gardens at their prime, and even some sites we're presenting, some sites have multiple periods, and we're able to show those and bring those out through our interpretation. What I'll be doing during this lecture is I'll be focusing on some of the data that has come out of a research that was undertaken for the Royal Horticultural Society with the help of Reading University, looking at climate change and potential climate change and the implications on gardens. And then I will sort of focus at the end on our gardens and some of the practical things I think we will face in different parts of the country. Well, we're looking at global temperatures are rising at least between 1.5 and 2 degrees over the next 100 years, with average temperatures projected to increase in all seasons across all regions in the UK. And it may be potentially possible that in the future we could be frost-free. Already in the last 10 years, in my own garden here in the Western Herefordshire, I've experienced 2 winters without frost, which has been quite a surprise. Also, there'll be an increase in the number of dry spells, that's periods without rain, and these will be more intense in the southern part of the UK, and especially over the summer months and possibly late spring. Together with this, there'll be a frequency of very wet days where you'll have sort of months of rain in about 2 hours. That can happen in the summer, but also we're looking at increased amount of rain during the winter. And actually, this is something that we experienced. We had a very, very wet autumn and early winter this year. And it's expected this will be most pronounced in the northern part of the UK. Also, we're expecting more flooding, particularly where we've got areas next to the coast and estuaries, and also areas upstream that will have to sort of respond to these sudden downpours that will produce flooding, and there will be impacts of that as well. So let's look into this data a bit. So this is the UK, and it's interesting to see the various air conditions that impact us. Largely, our sort of mean weather comes from the west, and that can have 2 impacts. If you look from the southwest, we've got sort of tropical maritime conditions coming from the Atlantic, and that's warm and moist, and that produces what people think is a sort of typical British weather, cloudy, rainy and mild. If you look at sort of the northwest, you've got polar maritime source, and that's sort of Greenland, Arctic Sea, where that's coming from. So that's wet and cold, and that gives us cold and showers. And so those are 2 very, very strong influences on our weather. Then if you look directly from the north, that's coming from the Arctic. So that's wet and cold. That's what gives us our snow in the winter. as you can see here, Britain is an island next to mainland Europe, and having this mostly warm sea around us, that gives us more benign weather than Central Europe, where that mass of land cools down in the winter and heats up in the summer. So there's also an impact from there. So if you look at the from the east, we've got that sort of polar continental from Central Europe, and that gives us cold in the winter and hot in the summer, snow in the winter and dry in the summer. And then you're looking from the southeast, and that's where we're getting tropical continental weather, sourced from North Africa, hot and dry, and particularly hot in the summer. These are the times when we're warned we'll be getting Saharan sand dropping on our cars. So these are sort of the influences on our weather. So remember that for a little bit later. So now focusing in, I've got a number of slides, particularly looking at temperature. Here we've got the annual mean Central England temperature shown as a difference from the averages from 1961 to 1990. And I think the main thing I'd like you to focus on is the red line. And what you can see there is that sort of annual mean temperature is very much on the way up, and you can see it's between, particularly from the 1970s, it's definitely starting to get warmer. And what is interesting, 8 out of the 10 warmest years of the UK have occurred since 2002. And so the most recent decade, up to 2015, was 0.9 degrees warmer than 1961 to 1990. So that shows something is very much changing. This graph here is looking at rainfall, precipitation in England and Wales during winter and summer. So our winter being December, January, February, and our summer being June, July, and August. And so what you can actually see is how precipitation in winter is increasing if you sort of follow that black line, and how precipitation in the summer on average is dropping. And I mean, one of the things that you can see in these graphs, that you've still got wet years and dry years, but it's that sort of mean that we are looking to follow, to see that pattern. So now we look at sea levels. So as a result of the reduction in the ice, both the far north of the globe and the far south of the globe, we've got sea levels rising. And so what is quite interesting here is to show this very significant level in sea level between 1900 and 2020. So, that's 1.4 millimeters per year. So this continual rise in sea levels around the coast of the UK will be increasing the risk of tidal and coastal flooding. If that is matched also with increased rainfall, particularly when there's high tides, this is then causing significant problems on sort of inland rivers, because the water can't get away. And so what about the winds and the storms? Because we're placed between a number of weather systems, we have had over decades very significant storms that have caused major destruction to gardens. We had such a storm that affected the north of England, and one of the gardens I'll show you later, Belsay Hall, had very bad damage. On one part of the garden, lost over 100 trees. Um, and so some of the influences that might have an impact on storm activity are sea surface temperatures, the extent of sea ice, mainly in the regions close to the poles. That will impact on the position and strength of global jet streams. And this is very important, as you'll see later, to the weather in the UK. And also the climate patterns that we've all heard about, such as the El Nino and the Indian Ocean dipole. So all these things come together. I mean, our Met Office think that this alone doesn't give clear data of increased storm activity, but the fact that we're going to get major changes and these different sort of ice oscillations and jet streams are likely to move, that will have quite a significant impact. So let's sort of summary of temperature and rain scenarios. So where we could be sort of by 2080 under the medium emission scenario. So average temperatures are projected to increase in all seasons all across the UK. Greater warming in the summer than in the winter. Levels of warming are largest in the south of the UK. But by the winters of 2080, winters could be between 1 and 5 degrees centigrade warmer, with summers between 1 and 6.5 degrees C warmer. So we've got quite a sort of significant change there. And then looking again at where we could be with precipitation by 2080. Very much increased precipitation in winter and a decrease in summer. And also there are greater uncertainties of the projections of precipitation than in temperature, because I think there's various things that can have an impact on this. The change to drier summers and wetter winters in most parts of the south half of the UK. And an increased intensity of rainfall is projected to occur throughout the UK. And I think this is something that will have a big impact, particularly in the summer. You know, when we have had a very long dry spell, you'll tend to get these periods of great intensity. So when you get a lot of rain going on very, very dry soils, that will then end up with flooding scenarios, and also losing quite a lot of topsoils being washed away and paths, and this will again have a major impact on gardens. One thing that's sort of worth pointing out is there's quite a distinction with the weather patterns between the north and the south of the UK. The south of the UK is very much influenced by continental Europe, is therefore you get great amount of that warming. The northern part of the UK tends to be much cooler the further north you go. The west side of the UK is much wetter, and the east side of the UK is much drier. And so that will, I think, be very much sort of enhanced in what will happen in the future. Looking at sort of a resume of the impact of climate change. So we're going to be looking at warmer springs and autumns with an extended growing season. This will result in some species flowering earlier, and also, rather than a sort of big dramatic autumn, we'll have a sort of a delayed autumn, possibly with less leaf fall, because a lot of the color that we get in our autumn color, it needs the frost to break down the sugars in the leaves. It will also mean an increased maintenance cost of our gardens. There'll be increased growth. We'll be having to cut our lawns much more often, and probably weaker growth when there's poor light in the spring and in the autumn. Also, the fact of having less frosts, less cold conditions, and a longer growing season might benefit some more tender ornamentals and edible plants. There is a sort of positive for plant growth that as a reduction in the cloud cover, the amount of solar radiation available to plant growth has increased by about 5% between 1961 and 1990. So that rather sort of balances up what I was talking about earlier. We need to consider the extreme rainfall events might increase the rate of nutrient loss, particularly nitrogen being washed out of the soil, how we might deal with that. So managing our soils properly, mulching, not leaving soil bare in the winter is very, very important. Having a good permanent planting. Dry spells are projected to increase together with rising temperatures, particularly in summer. This will be a challenge for us and will increase need for irrigation. And it's actually particularly when we get a dry late springs. Those are times when our plants want to be putting on growth and need that supply of water. Probably not so bad in the summer when they've already made their growth. So these are the things that we need to be looking at. So again, managing soils is going to be very, very important, making mulching and making sure we have good cover. The other thing that is a great concern is the warmer conditions will enable the increased spread of pests and diseases. There won't be that winter break. The fact that you've got a sort of longer, milder conditions mean that new species of pests and diseases can advance more quickly and potentially have a longer period in which to cause damage. And changes in seasonal temperatures, such as sort of drying and waterlogging, will also put more stress on plants, making them more susceptible to new threats. And I think that's one thing that we need to be focusing more on, that plants that have less stress are able to withstand change more greatly. So it's a sort of perfect storm that we've got massive changes that are putting more stress on plants and new diseases coming in. And so thinking how we can counteract that. Location, microclimate and soils, I think, will have an even greater impact on plants that can be grown. And because we have a very generally a benign climate in the UK, I think we're going to get much more distinct climate variations in the UK that in some ways could result in more interesting gardens. I think I would regard this as a positive, that if you've got much deeper clay soils and you're in the west, that will give you a much more benign climate. But if you've got sandy soils in the east, you're going to be looking at having to go for much more Mediterranean type planting. And again, you've got sort of shorter summers in the north and longer, hotter summers in the south. So I think that is one aspect that will have a major impact on us that could be positive too. I'd like to focus now on pests and diseases, and this information was gathered together by the Forestry Commission in some research they did in 2002. And that shows the cumulative increase in the number of new pest and disease outbreaks affecting trees between 1971 and 2002. And you can see until sort of about the early 1980s, it's going up, but it's fairly level. And then you've got quite a significant increase. Then you've got it's sort of levelish, but not too bad until the end of the 1990s. And then we've got a very, very significant increase. There's two things that I think are affecting that. Greater movement of plants across Europe as being a member of the EU. And what we have seen is plants being introduced to some nurseries in Italy from China, becoming changing from being Chinese plants to Italian plants, and after a couple of weeks, then being distributed around Europe. And I think in certain places where the rules haven't been followed closely enough, that has resulted with a lot of sort of non-European pests and diseases coming into Europe. Then with free transport around Europe, these very, very quickly spread throughout Europe. And I think it's quite interesting, very, very distinct change from the late 1990s to the present day, and that chart is still going. The next slide shows sort of the range of the disease. 1971 was the Dutch elm disease. It wasn't the disease that was Dutch; it was the elms that were Dutch, not the disease. And you can see this very much increasing. 2002, Phytophthora ramorum has had a significant impact. A wonderful woodland garden, Brodick in Scotland, being very badly affected by that, and our plant health people coming into there, and the garden looked as if it had been napalmed. It was dreadful. Horse chestnut leaf miner has very much affected the value of horse chestnuts as an ornamental tree. From summer they just look ugly. Leaf miner doesn't kill the trees; it just weakens them. But in 2005, you got the bleeding canker of horse chestnut that is then taking advantage of these weakened trees. It may have been that the trees would not have been so badly impacted if they hadn't already got the stress of the horse chestnut leaf miner on them. I'll be coming to oak processionary moth, which came in 2006 in a moment. Other things I'd just like to point out to you. Oh yes, Cyrococcus sugae, introduced in 2014. That has affected us directly. One of our very important historic sites, Chiswick Park in London, designed by William Kent for Lord Burlington. We had a major restoration project and propagated our historic cedars so that we could replant them where they'd been lost. These really good trees from a good provenance were replanted, but their timing was poor, and they caught this fungal disease. It's a type of fungal mildew, and they've had to be removed, and we'll be keeping that area clear of trees for about 4 years, and hopefully we can replant new propagated specimens then. So it particularly affects young cedars. Old cedars don't seem to be so badly affected yet. The other one to point out to you, 2012 ash dieback, is sort of devastating ash throughout the UK. But whereas Dutch elm disease wiped out all the elms because most of those were clones, we're hoping that our ash won't be so badly affected because they are seed origin plants. There is likely to be more genetic variability and some varieties that will withstand the disease. So you can see the concern we have over diseases that I think will well be understood in our friends in the Southern Hemisphere. This slide here shows the spread of the oak processionary moth. This was introduced in West London, and they've been trying to keep it sort of established and to stop its spread. But you can see with the blue squares how last year it started to spread outside the sort of the London zone they were hoping to keep it in. The main issue with this particular pest is not just the damage it might cause to oaks, but this is an insect that lays its eggs in the trees. You will then have thousands of caterpillars that have very, very fine hairs. As the caterpillars shed their skins, they're then shedding these hairs into the environment, and these will result in very allergic reactions to people that can be anything from the first impact might be a slight rash or a bit of a cough, to very, very serious rashes, to serious asthma, and there's concern that on some it could cause anaphylactic shock. So managing this, particularly in sort of public parks and urban areas, is of great concern. Moving on to the next slide, I'd just like to sort of give a quick summary of some of our sites and the impacts. So here we have Audley End on the borders between Cambridgeshire and Essex. So this is in the east of the country. So this is one of these sites that will have difficulties with very hot summers. And so what we see, these wonderful Brownian green lawns will go brown in the summer. That's not so much of a problem, but also we will the River Cam that flows through the site. We will no doubt have more flood issues from that. We may find we have an excellent Victorian kitchen garden, and will no doubt get better crops due to a longer growing season. Some of our issues that we will have is we'll need to irrigate a lot more, both in the kitchen garden and particularly some of the formal bedding areas that we hope we can still maintain. Belsay Hall, the first slide of the quarry garden that I showed at the start of my lecture. This is what you will find at Belsay Hall. This is a garden with a very particular climate. It's up in Northumberland, so it's in the northeast, so it'll be much cooler. It is drier than it would be if it was in the northwest, but it's still wetter than what you would get down south. But we'll still get a sort of longer season, perhaps with less frosts than we're getting now. So I think sites like these will be very important to be able to grow some of the rhododendron gardens that will no longer be able to grow in the southeast of England, because it still has that a bit of cool and more moisture. Brodsworth Hall is in South Yorkshire, and this is a very much a sort of garden-esque Victorian garden with clipped topiary and massed bedding and a Victorian rock garden and quarry dells. We will suffer because we're sort of roughly in the middle of the country. So we will suffer from drought in the summer. So we need to look at how we are going to maintain our bedding systems. We will probably have challenges with sort of new pests and diseases that will affect our topiary, particularly things like box blight and box beetle. So there's continue to be issues here. Another one of our sites, this is the home of Charles Darwin, Down House, and here we're telling the story of Charles Darwin and the experiments that he carried out on site. Managing glasshouse collections, so be keeping our glass houses cool in the summer will be a major challenge. It will be a benefit that we won't need so much oil to heat our glass houses in the winter. One of our major issues, though, will be this is on very shallow, chalky soils, although there are some areas with clay which do hold the moisture better. So we will have major problems with summer drought here. Northern Palace is in South London, very much an arts and crafts garden. We have a moat around it, very clay soils. So I imagine this is one of the sites where we may well get problems with sort of flooding in the summer when that clay cracks and hardens. Downpours, we will get flooding, but we will also have the issues with drought. So I can think the herbaceous board that you're seeing there will need to move to perhaps more Mediterranean species. And I think we'll have issues across a lot of our gardens in the south growing plants that originate in Japan that that can deal with cold winters, but what they want is warm, wet summers. And I think what we won't be having is warm, wet summers. And so that will present a challenge to us. We're already facing issues at Kenilworth Castle. So this is a reconstruction of a garden created for Elizabeth I in 1575. One of the important collections here was gillyflowers and carnations. Well, part of that. We've had to stop growing carnations because of new carnation fungal diseases. And so and I think where we've got specific collections and new diseases, this will provide us with big challenges. It was a big thing on this garden, was scent, and so not being able to have carnations and pinks is impacting on visitors' experience. This is Kenwood in the north of London. So you're looking down London from house, and we've major problem, I think, will be drought in the summer. There's quite an extensive rhododendron collection there, and I expect by 2080 it'll be very difficult to maintain that. The other major worry, I think, also will be following summer droughts is intense rainfalls, because it's a widely used public park. Soils tend to be very compacted, and so you can just imagine on this sloped site, the water will literally rush into those water bodies, and we'll need to very much manage our dams to avoid flooding. So flooding issues, I think, will be a problem here. This is the home of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert on the Isle of Wight. And so this is about as south as you can get to England. This is on the Isle of Wight, as I said. And so I think the main issue here will be summer drought and perhaps storms coming off the sea, particularly in the sort of the winter and autumn. This is another very southerly garden. This is Walmer. This is just next to Dover, and again, we've got very gravelly soils. This is probably one of our mildest gardens, together with Osborne, and I think summer drought is going to be the major problem. The benefit for such a garden, and also our garden on the Isle of Wight, is very good light levels, so we'll be able to grow a much wider range of plants, but we need to be keeping those plants alive in the summer, I think, will be our challenge. And you will only see nice green lawns in the winter, spring and autumn. A Whitley Court in the west of England, where we've got sort of large parterres, such as the one you can see here, designed by Nesfield. But we've also got woodland gardens. And I think being in the west of the country, where it will continue to get more rainfall, it will be a bit cooler than it is further south. Hopefully these sorts of gardens will continue to be able to grow uh, rhododendrons, but there'll be a bit more diversity of the plants that we can grow. You can again see there's lakes. There'll be potential impacts on flooding, and so that's one thing we need. We're already looking at, making sure that our lakes are sustainable. So here we have Rest Park, which is in Bedfordshire. So this is in the south of England. This tends to be on the eastern side. So we are going to get these hot, dry summers. But we're in 3/4 of the site very deep clay soils, and as you can see, it's a site with many lakes and waterways. The advantage of clay soils is they do hold moisture, so I think that's going to be a positive thing. That will help us deal with the summer longer, but it'll still put stress on those trees. The major issue for us will be maintaining our grand Victorian parterres. Will those be sustainable in the future? Will we need to change our planting? Probably the answer is yes. And just to finish up, I mean, I think the main thing we need to be considering going forward is training up the future. And I think one of the key things is if we have new gardeners coming in that are able to deal with adaptation, what we will see is change. Gardeners are used to managing change. That's what we do daily. But this will be more extreme going forward. One of the schemes we manage at English Heritage is Historic Botanic Garden Training Programme. This provides 12 months for a trainee in gardens across the UK, not just English Heritage. We've trained over 300 of these over the last 15 or so years. We've had over 56 different host gardens. We also, as part of this, we run seminars and masterclasses for our trainees, and we also support the supervisors in the gardens and how to mentor the trainees. So, so this is training the trainers and also helping to produce the new professionals who will be dealing with this, and this will be very much their problem. We want to ensure that they're equipped. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.